Do you get lower back pain whilst sitting? If you do, we're going to talk through how we can start to minimise that risk with sitting posture and, in some respects, sort of movement and mitigation of risk and load on the spine, so we can minimise that stress on the spine and minimise lower back pain. We're going to do that by looking at three parts. We're going to look at what's happening when we sit down in a flex position, what happens when we're sat down in an upright position, and then talk about transitioning between the two. And then in the final part, as we summarise, I will also talk about sitting more generally and postures to use. In part one, it's sitting with a flex spine. So what that basically means is you're sitting slouched. So your hips are tucked under, your posture's forward, your head's potentially up like that. This is how most people will sit. Now, what this flexed position is doing, there are a couple of things. Well, there are three things that we're going to talk about. So number one, there's a low abdominal activity. So the muscles of the abdominals aren't really doing any work, and they aren't really doing their job. And part of their job is to stabilize the spine by creating something called intra-abdominal pressure. If we then go on to part two, we've then got the extensor muscles. Again, because they're flexed, because they've gone long, they're inactive. Again, a part of their role is to mitigate certain forces on the spine and again, stabilize it in a position. So what's essentially happening is your spine is most at risk in this posture. So if we are sitting for prolonged periods of time, which our spine or our body in general doesn't like, then it's going to be increasing risk of any pain. The final thing that comes with that is when we sit in this position, what we're also doing with a flexed spine is we're putting excess stress on the discs. So if you can imagine, you've got a disc here. So this is a bird's eye view of a disc. You've got fibrous wall around the outside and you've got a jelly-like fluid in the middle. When we go into this flexed posture, the jelly-like fluid is being pushed towards the back. So if you could imagine, I've got a pip inside my index finger and thumb, and I push down on the front of it, it's going to want to pop out the back. That's what wants to happen to the fluid on the inside of your disc, which is then a contribution to disc bulge, disc herniation. So it's going to essentially cause a problem. Now, it doesn't have to get that far because you may have back pain due to certain muscle activity or lack thereof. So again, we have to understand that before we go into part two, when we talk about sitting upright. Part two is sitting upright, which is when we start talking about sitting, or when I start talking about sitting to a room full of people, is what they start doing automatically, which is they sit much more up like this. Now, this has some advantages, and it's essentially the opposite to what I've talked about before. So when we come up into this position, we will tend to have a little bit more of an abdominal engagement. So just to get me up here, I can feel it working just naturally. So we've got a little bit more of the abdominal activation, which is giving us a little bit more stability of the spine. So if you can imagine, these muscles are like the guy wires on a tent, for example. So if we just left a tent up and the wind blew without any guy wires, it's going to be flapping around. If, however, we put guy wires down and the wind blows, the tent is going to stay relatively sturdy. That's essentially what's happening to the spine when we come upright. So we've got the abdominals working, which then fit into part number two. We've then also got some more extensor activity, which again is going to be adding to the stability. It's going to be putting some neutralizing forces into the spine. So again, it's just a slightly more advantageous position to be in. The final thing with the discs, because we're not flexed down like this, what's happening is if we get that example of the pip and in between the thumb and index finger, what we're now doing is we're pushing down straight on top of it. So we're not pushing the front down and it's getting pushed out the back. We're pushing straight down on the top. So it's being held in the middle. So again, the forces are being neutralized. And that's the position, the more advantageous position to be in. Now what we're going to look at in the next part is transitioning from here to here. This is relatively simple. What we're basically talking about is going from that slouched position to the upright position, because in some respects, there's sort of two ways that people can do it, but we need to get sort of a best of both worlds, if you will. So if we're in this position, what some people will do is they will lift their chest. Now that can create problems in the lumbo-thoraco sort of junction, where the thoracic spine and the lumbar spine meet, because what they're doing, they're flexed here, and then all of a sudden they sort of come up. So it can just create some laxity there, which again can create some instability, which can then create some aggravation there. The other way of doing it is they will sort of just roll the hip, so they won't really get anything from the upper back. And again, that can create a little bit more of a laxity down in the hips. As you can probably understand, we want to get a mixture of the two. So what we want to be doing is not only are we lifting the chest, but we're coming through there. Because again, if we need to go from this position to this position, we don't want to get all of that in one place. As I've talked about neutralizing forces, we don't want to get 100% of the movement from here, because then we're going to be putting all the force going through the thoracolumbar junction. We don't want to get it all from here, because we don't want to put it all on the S1L5 junction. What we want to do is we want to neutralize that and sort of evenly distribute it between the two, so we come up using the hips and the chest. And that's what gets us a little bit more upright, which is a much safer way of doing it. What we're going to look at in part 4 is sort of a caveat that comes with everything that I've just said. A part of how we can minimise lower back pain whilst we're sitting is changing posture. So I've just talked about two, the slouched posture and the upright posture. Now obviously the upright posture is more advantageous than the slouched posture. But if we are stationary, then we're going to experience problems if we're constantly here. Because what's happening is when we go into a posture, we are basically putting stress on certain areas of the body. So if we are here, we are putting certain stresses on the body. Obviously, they're a little bit more evenly distributed than if we're here, so it's slightly more advantageous. But what we have to understand is that when we're sat down, our body in general doesn't like being stationary. So we have to think about moving around whilst we're sat down stationary. So we need to think about changing position. So that might be using the upright position, but also sitting right back and using a backrest if you've got one. If you've got anything you can sort of rest your head against, use that as well, because again, that will just minimise a little bit of muscle activity, which will minimise fatigue, which will then minimise any stress on the body. So we've got the changing of position, just sort of coming upright and then leaning back. You can lean forward, put your arm or chin on sort of your fist or something like that. Lean on the armrest, lean on the other armrest. Change the leg position. One leg forward, one leg back. So again, all we're trying to do is change your position. Drop one leg underneath the seat, perch on the edge. Again, all of these different positions are going to be moving these loads around so the muscles then don't become fatigued. Because as I've mentioned, if we're up here, we've got muscle activity, eventually those muscles are going to fatigue. So if we can move around, we can sort of activate certain muscles and then shut off other ones. And then when we change posture, we open up those or activate those muscles and shut off those. So again, we're moving that around, allowing the muscles to recover so they don't completely fatigue, which is going to make sitting much more advantageous for you and be a potential in helping you overcome your lower back pain. So to quickly summarize this video, we've talked about sat down in a slouched position, sat down in a upright position. We've talked about the disadvantages of the slouched position and the advantages and disadvantages of the upright position. And then we've talked about transitioning between the two by getting it from the hips and the chest, and then finally talking about how we change position to be able to mitigate load or migrate load around the spine and around the torso so we can minimize our risk of lower back pain. And if you are struggling with lower back pain, just click the link below, go through to my How to Overcome Lower Back Pain coaching and consultation page, fill out your details, fill out submit that, fill out the 2 questionnaires. That will come through to me. I will then go about building a rehab plan for you, when we sit down during the consultation, be 45 minutes, through Zoom, face-to-face, I'll say, where I'll be able to dig in a little bit more detail about your back pain, and then I can start putting together a specific lower back pain rehab plan for you. And then we've got 2 weeks after that of online support to help you implement it as well. So if that sounds like something that you'd like to do, click the link below and get started today.